She came up the road in the worst of the storm, and she wasn't carrying a single thing a person carries when they mean to stay. No trunk, no bedroll, no second pair of boots tied over her shoulder. Just a baby, wrapped so tight against her chest you'd have thought the wind would have to go through her to get to it. I've been keeping the books on this ranch for 19 winters. I count things. Cattle, coins, coffee beans, the days a man's been gone before you stop expecting him back. And I'll tell you, I have never been able to make that woman's arrival come out even. Some sums don't. Because here's what doesn't add up. A person doesn't walk into a blizzard with nothing unless what they left behind was worse than the cold. And a person doesn't stay through a Montana winter with hands that have never roped or branded or buried, unless something in them is harder than the rest of us guessed. By the time the snow let go of the valley and the first green came up along the creek, the men who'd wanted her gone in November were the same men who'd have fought to keep her. The ranch had a heart it hadn't had before, and the heart had a name, and the name belonged to a stranger who showed up owning nothing. This is the story of how that happened. I was there for most of it. The parts I wasn't there for, I learned later, the hard way, the way you learn most things worth knowing. Let me tell you how she arrived first. Then you can decide for yourself whether the cold sent her or saved her. The dog started up before any of us heard a thing, and that's how I knew it was real. Old Sutter, that's the dog, named for a man who cheated my granddaddy out of a mule, which tells you the kind of esteem we held the animal, and Sutter could sleep through gunfire. He'd slept through the night 2 of the bunkhouse roof came off in '79. But that evening in late November he came off the porch board stiff-legged and pointed his whole gray body down the wagon road, and the low sound he made wasn't a bark. It was the other thing, the warning. I set down my pen. I'd been at the ledger, squaring up what the fall drive had cost us against what it had brought in, which that year was a sum that made a man want to drink and pray in roughly equal measure. The lamp guttered. Outside, the storm had been building all afternoon, the sky going the color of a healing bruise, and now the first of the real snow had come, not the lazy kind, the kind that means business, blowing flat across the yard like it had somewhere to be. Walt, that was Prout, one of the younger hands, sticking his head in the door with his hat already crusted white. Somebody on the road. Somebody walking. Somebody walking. Now you have to understand. We were 12 miles from the nearest town worth the name, and that town wasn't worth much. In good weather a man might walk it in a long half-day. In that storm, walking it would be a thing you did because the only other choice was lying down in the snow and quitting, and even then most folks would pick the quitting. So when Prout said somebody was walking, my first thought wasn't charity. It was trouble. Trouble walks. Honest travelers ride or they stay home. I pulled on my coat, the good one, the one with the buttons that still buttoned, and went out into it. She was maybe 200 yards down the road when I first made her out, and she was not walking so much as she was failing to fall down. You know that gait. Each step a small disaster, the next step barely corrected. The wind had her skirts plastered to her legs on one side and tearing loose on the other, and her shawl had gone the color of the air around it, so that for a moment she looked like a thing the storm had assembled out of itself and pushed up the road as a joke. Then I saw the bundle. She had both arms crossed over her chest, and inside the cross of her arms was something she was protecting from the wind with the whole architecture of her body, leaning into the gusts at an angle that should have toppled her, turning her shoulder to take the worst of it, so that the bundle stayed always in the one pocket of stillness her body could make. I have seen men do that with a wounded comrade and with a sack of stolen gold. The posture's the same. But this was neither, and I knew it before I was close enough to know it, the way you know weather. "Ma'am," I had to shout it twice. The wind ate the first one whole. She lifted her face, and it was a young face under the ice on her eyebrows, younger than I'd braced for, and her lips had gone a color lips shouldn't go. She tried to say something. Nothing came but a sound. I'm not a tender man. I want that on the record, because what I did next has been told around this ranch in ways that make me out softer than I am. The truth is I did what you do. I got an arm around her, and I took the weight she couldn't carry anymore, and I felt her flinch when I touched the bundle not away from me, but around it tighter, one more layer of herself between it and the world, and that flinch told me everything the rest of the night would only confirm. There was a baby in there, and she would die before she let go of it. Those two facts arrived together, and they have never once come apart since. We got her to the house. Not the bunkhouse, the big one, where Mr. Edmund Reese lived alone with 2 rooms shut up and gathering dust, and 1 room he actually used. That was a decision I made on the porch and would have to answer for inside, and I knew it, and I made it anyway. The bunkhouse was warm, but it was 11 men and no privacy, and a stranger half froze with an infant was not a thing you carried into 11 men. So I carried her to Reese's door and kicked it because my hands were full. And when he opened it with his reading spectacles still on his nose and his book still in his hand, I watched his face do the thing faces do when the night turns out larger than the evening promised. "Good Lord," Reese said, "what have you brought me, Walt?" "Don't rightly know yet," I said, "but it's breathing and there's 2 of it." We put her by the fire. Mrs. Acaffer, she cooked for us then, an enormous gentle woman who'd come up from Texas after the war and stayed because the cold kept the bugs down. She said, though I think the truth was simpler and sadder than that. Mrs. Acaffer came over from her quarters and took charge in the way that women take charge of certain things that men should know better than to touch. She peeled the frozen shawl away. She got the bundle free of the woman's arms, which took some doing, because even half-conscious the woman would not give it up. And Mrs. Acaffer had to say, low and steady, the same 6 words over and over, "I have her, I have her, I have her," until the arms believed it and let go. It was a girl, maybe 4 months, blue around the mouth but breathing, and when the warmth hit her she did the most ordinary, miraculous thing. She cried. A thin, furious, alive sound. I have heard that exact sound 100 times since from 100 lambs and calves and once from my own sister's child long ago, and it always lands the same place in me, low and to the left, the place that doesn't keep books. The woman heard the cry, and only then did she let herself go under. Like she'd been holding the door against the dark with her shoulder, and the moment someone else put a hand on it, she could finally fall. We didn't get her name till near midnight. By then she'd come around enough to sit up and take broth, though her hands shook so bad Mrs. Acaffer had to steady the cup. The baby was asleep against her. They'd wrapped them both in every quilt in the house, and the kitchen had gone close and warm and smelled of wood smoke and wet wool, and the particular clean milk smell of an infant, which is a smell I'd forgotten I knew. Reese sat across the room with his arms crossed, not unkind but not soft either, a man doing sums of his own about what this would cost him in feed and trouble and talk. "You got a name?" he asked her. She looked at him a long moment, and I'll tell you, there was a whole conversation in that look. She was deciding something. You could watch her decide it. "Della," she said finally, and then, like it cost her, "the baby's Pearl." "Della what?" "Just Della, quiet, but it had a floor under it. A man knows when he's hit the bottom of what someone will give, and Reese had hit it. "All right," he said. He's a fair man, Reese, in his stony way. "Just Della. You headed somewhere, just Della, or running from somewhere." And here she did a thing that decided me on her, though I couldn't have said why at the time. She didn't lie. A lying woman would have spun us a husband killed in a mine, a sister in Missoula, a wagon broke down on the pass. She had the broth warmth and the firelight and the easy mark of 2 tired men, and she could have had anything she wanted off us for the price of a good story. We'd have eaten it up, we wanted to. Instead she said, "Running," and then looking down at the baby in a voice that had stopped performing, "And I'm not going to tell you from what, because if I tell you, you'll have to decide what you think about it, and I'm too tired tonight to be decided about." She lifted her eyes. "I can cook. I can scrub and mend, and I learn fast, and I don't eat much. Give us a week out of the storm, and I'll work it off, and we'll be gone before we're a problem. That's the whole deal I've got to offer." Reese looked at me. I looked at the baby. Outside, the wind was throwing itself against the house like it wanted in, like it had followed her up the road and meant to finish what it started. "It's a week," Reese said. "We'll talk again when the snow lets up." It didn't let up for 9 days. By the time it did, the question of the week had quietly stopped being a question, and nobody had decided it, which is how the most important things tend to get decided. Here is what I noticed about Della in those first days, set down in roughly the order I noticed it, because I'm a man who keeps lists, and the list is more honest than any speech I could make. 1. She couldn't cook. Not really. The first morning she took over from Mrs. Ackafer, who had the rheumatism bad that week and was glad of it. Della burned the bacon and underdid the biscuits and made coffee you could have used to strip paint. And she did all of it with a kind of grim determination that suggested she knew exactly how bad it was and was going to do it anyway until it got better. She'd lied about that, see? Not about running, about the cooking. She'd said, "I can cook the way a drowning person says I can swim," meaning I will, or I'll die learning. 2. She watched. God, she watched. By the third morning the bacon was right because she'd watched Mrs. Ackafer's hands and stolen the timing of it. By the fifth, the biscuits had gone from gravel to something a man would reach for twice. She learned the way I've seen exactly 2 other people learn in my life, and both of them had been hungry as children. There's a kind of attention that only comes out of need. She had it. 3. She never put the baby down where she couldn't see it. Not once. The men rigged her a basket and a sling and she used both, but always the child was in her sightline, and every few minutes I clocked it. I told you I count things. Every few minutes her eyes would go to Pearl and check, and come back, check and come back. A rhythm under everything she did, steady as a clock you stop hearing. I have known mothers. That wasn't ordinary mothering. That was a woman who had decided, at some specific moment I didn't yet know about, that this child would not leave her sight again as long as she drew breath. The again in that sentence is the thing that took me till spring to understand. 4. She flinched at horses on the road. Not at the horses. At hearing one come up the road. The first time a rider approached the house, just Coleman back from the line shack, nobody, nothing. She went white and still in the kitchen and her hand found Pearl, and she didn't breathe right again until she'd seen it was just Coleman, just one of ours. Whoever she was running from, she expected him to come on horseback. She expected him, period. That was the thing. She didn't act like a woman who'd gotten away. She acted like a woman taking a breath between waves. 5. And this is the one that turned the men. More than any of the rest, she was funny. Not in a way she meant for us. In a way that slipped out when she'd worked herself past being afraid for an hour at a time. Young Prout, who is an idiot of the most loyal kind, knocked the whole crock of sourdough starter onto the floor the second week, a thing Mrs. Ackafer would have skinned him for, and stood there waiting for the world to end. And Della looked at the mess and looked at his face and said, dry as a dust road, "Well, we've been needing to feed the floor. It does so much for us." And Prout laughed so hard he had to sit down, and after that he'd have walked into the lake for her. That's how it goes with a crew of hard men. You don't win them with weeping or with pretty looks, though Lord knows pretty looks open the door. You win them by being funny when the starter hits the floor, by being one of them in the small disaster. She knew that, or she found it out, and either way it worked. But I'm getting ahead of the cold, and I promised myself I'd tell this true, in order, the way it landed. The first hard thing came 9 days in, the night the storm finally broke. I was up, I'm always up. The books don't keep themselves and my hip doesn't let me sleep past 4 anymore, and I heard her in the kitchen before dawn. I went to see was the baby sick. She wasn't crying. The kitchen was dark except for the banked coals, and Della was sitting at the table with Pearl asleep in the basket beside her, and she had something in her hand she was looking at. And when she heard me she closed her hand around it fast, the way you do with a thing that's yours and only yours. "Couldn't sleep," she said. "Storm's quit, you hear it quit." She nodded. And here's the thing about a storm quitting after 9 days, it gets so loud you've stopped hearing it, and then it stops, and the silence is the loudest thing in the world. It wakes you. The absence wakes you. She'd heard the absence, and it had brought her to the table in the dark with whatever was in her hand. I'm not a man who pries, but I'd carried her up the road, and I'd watched her flinch at horses for 9 days, and something in me, the part that doesn't keep books, wanted to know what we were keeping under our roof. That storm bought you time, I said. Whoever's coming, storm bought you 9 days he couldn't ride either. Her hand tightened. How'd you know somebody's coming? Lady, I've watched you jump at every horse on the road like it was the devil's own. A man learns to read sign or a man doesn't last out here. Your sign I can read. She was quiet a long while. The coals ticked. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote said its piece and another answered, and pearls stirred in her basket and settled. Then she opened her hand. It was a daguerreotype, the small kind, in a little tin case worn smooth at the corners from handling. She turned it to catch what light there was. 2 women, young, standing stiff the way you have to for those old plates in their good dresses in front of a painted backdrop of a garden that didn't exist. One of them was Della, younger, softer, before whatever had carved her down to what sat at my table. And the other. My sister, Della said, Ruth. I waited, you let people get to it. Pearl's hers, Della said. And then the floor came out from under the easy version of the story I'd been telling myself. The runaway wife version, the abused girl version, all the versions where the baby was simply hers and the trouble simply a man. Ruth's, not mine. Ruth died in October, and the man Pearl belongs to under the law, the man whose name is on the paper, he's the one coming up that road. And he's got every right to her, and I took her anyway, and I'd do it again, and that's the thing I told you I was too tired to be decided about. She looked at me with her chin level. You decided about it now. I have turned that question over more times than I can count. You decided about it now. Because here's the heavy part, the part the title of this story sells short. It's easy to root for the woman who saved a baby from the cold. Everybody roots for that. But Della hadn't saved Pearl from the cold. She'd taken Pearl out into the cold, out of a warm house, away from a man with a lawful claim, into a Montana winter on foot with no plan past not there. From the outside, in the eyes of the law and the church and most decent people, what Della had done was steal a man's child. From the inside, and I didn't know the inside yet, it was something else. But I didn't know it yet. All I had at that table was a tired woman and a sleeping baby and a tin photograph of a dead girl, and the question hanging in the cold kitchen air. You decided about it now. I'm ashamed to say I didn't answer her that night. I said something about how it wasn't my call, it was Reese's, and I'd not say a word to him she didn't want said, which was a coward's answer dressed as a kind one. She heard it for what it was. She closed the case over her sister's face and said, "Fair enough," in a voice that had stopped expecting much from men, and that was the end of it for then. But I lay awake the rest of that night, and what kept me up wasn't whether she was a thief. What kept me up was the way she'd said I'd do it again. No heat in it. No defiance, even. Just a fact, flat as the ledger line, a sum she'd already worked all the way to the bottom and found she could stand behind. I didn't know yet why Ruth had died. I didn't know what the man whose name was on the paper had done, or would do, to put that particular flatness in a woman's voice. I'd find that out in the deep of the winter, and when I did, I'd understand why none of us, not one of the hard men on that ranch, would lift a hand to help him collect what the law said was his. But that's part 2. That's the cold getting colder before it ever thinks about spring. What I'll leave you with from that first 9 days is this. When the storm broke and the road opened, Reese came to me in the barn and said, "Well, snow's gone. She'll be moving on, I expect." And I found I'd already decided something after all, somewhere between the table and the barn, without permission from the part of me that keeps books. "I expect she won't," I said. "I expect she'll stay till the man comes, and I expect when he comes we ought to be standing in front of her when he does." Reese looked at me for a long time. He's known me 30 years. He knows what it costs me to say a sentence like that one. "You'd better be right about her, Walt," he said. He didn't say right about what. He didn't have to. We were both already in it by then. We just didn't know how deep. December is when the ranch found out who she was. Not her name we never did get past, just Della. I mean the other thing. The thing a person is made of, that you only see when the weather strips the rest away. The cold that year was a cruelty even by Montana standards. We lost calves we shouldn't have lost. The creek froze so hard the cattle couldn't break it, and we had to chop water for 200 head twice a day, which is the kind of work that turns young men old and old men into ghosts of themselves by February. The hands came in at night so cold they couldn't get their own boots off, and there'd be Della, who couldn't cook in November, with something hot on the table that by December she could cook, by God, and a way about her of receiving frozen men into a warm room that I have never seen in another living soul before or since. She'd learned each of them. That's the only way I can put it. She knew Coleman wouldn't talk till he'd had coffee and you mustn't make him, and she knew Prout would talk too much and needed somebody to laugh at him so he didn't feel a fool. And she knew old Halloran had buried a wife and 2 children before he came west, and that the smell of cinnamon undid him. So she never made cinnamon when he was at the table. Never once, though the others loved it. She'd make it the days he rode the far line and missed supper, and she'd save him a plain plate. And he never knew why, and I never told him. That's not cooking. I want to be plain about this, because the title of this thing says she became the heart of the ranch, and that sounds like a sweet thing, a soft thing, and it was not soft. It was the hardest kind of work there is. It is the work of paying attention to other people when you are frightened and tired and grieving and have a child to keep alive. She did the hardest work on the ranch, and she did it with a smile that I came, over that winter, to understand was itself a kind of labor, hauled up fresh every morning the way the rest of us hauled water. The men didn't see all that. The men just knew the place felt different, warmer than the stoves accounted for. They started shaving more. Prout washed his neck. Coleman, who I'd swear had not laughed since Garfield was shot, was heard to laugh. There was singing in the bunkhouse some nights which there had not been in years. A ranch is a body, and a body can be alive or just not dead, and ours had been just not dead for a long while, and now it was alive, and the aliveness had walked up the road in a blizzard owning nothing. And the whole time, every one of us was waiting for the horse on the road. His name was Garrett Voss, and he came on the 11th of January, and he did not come alone. I'll tell you how I knew it was him before he reached the yard. Della had been at the window. She was always a little at the window, that checking rhythm, but aimed outward now at the road. And that morning she went still in a way she hadn't gone still since the first week, and she set down the bowl she was holding very carefully, like it might break if she let go of her control of it for 1 second, and she said, not to me, not to anyone, just to the cold glass, "He's brought the sheriff. 2 riders, one of them with a star." Now I want to do this part justice, because it's the hinge the whole story turns on, and it would be easy to make Voss a monster and be done. He wasn't a monster, that's the worst of it. He was a tall, well-made man of maybe 40, well-dressed for the country, with the kind of face people trust, open, weathered, handsome, a good firm handshake. You could see the handshake coming from across the yard. He had papers. He had the law's own representative riding beside him. He had, by every measure the world keeps its books in, the right. He came into the yard and took off his hat to Reese, courteous as a deacon, and he said his piece in a voice built to be believed. His late wife's sister had taken his infant daughter from his home in October in a state of grief madness, he said, and he'd searched all winter, sick with worry, and he'd traced her here, and he asked only to take his child home. He even had moisture in his eyes when he said his child. I watched for it. It was there. The man believed himself. That's a thing I've learned about the worst kinds of men. The very worst of them believe themselves completely. The sheriff, Del Hutchins, a tired man I'd known some years, not corrupt but not curious either, the kind of lawman who likes the law because it saves him the trouble of judgment. Hutchins looked at the papers and looked at the ground and said, "Reese, you got the woman here or not?" Voss has got a court paper. This is about as simple as my job gets. And it would have been simple. It would have ended right there in the cold yard, the baby handed over, the law satisfied, all of us going back to chopping water for the cattle and telling ourselves we'd done what we had to. Except Della came out of the house. She came out with Pearl in her arms, and she walked into the middle of the yard, into the space between Voss and the door, and she stood there in the cold without a coat, and she did not weep or plead. She looked at Garrett Voss, and Garrett Voss looked at her, and for 1 second the believing himself face slipped, and I saw underneath it the thing she'd walked into a blizzard to get away from. It wasn't there long. He put the deacon's face back on fast, but I saw it. Reese saw it. Even Hutchins, tired as he was, saw something because he shifted in his saddle. "Tell them," Della said to Voss, quiet. "Tell them what happened to Ruth. You've got the papers. Tell them the rest, and I'll hand you this baby myself, and not one man here will stop you. Tell them the truth and you can have her. That's the deal." And then, when he said nothing, when the yard had gone so quiet you could hear the cold ticking in the eaves, "No. Then I'll tell them, and you can call me a liar in front of the law, and we'll see whose face Sheriff Hutchins believes." Here is the thing she told. I set it down plain because she set it down plain, standing coatless in January, and it deserves to be told the way she told it. Ruth, her sister, had married Garrett Voss 4 years back, and within the year the bruises started, in the places a high collar covers. Della had begged her to leave. Ruth couldn't the way they can't, for reasons that look like weakness from the outside and are something else entirely from the inside, something closer to a slow drowning where you've forgotten the surface is even up there. Then Pearl came. And a man like Voss, Della said, doesn't change when the baby comes. He just adds the baby to the list of things he can use to keep you. Where would you go with an infant? Who'd take you in with another man's mouth to feed, stay, or starve her? That arithmetic. He kept Ruth with that arithmetic. In October, Ruth fell down the stairs. That's what the doctor wrote. That's what the county believed, because Voss has a handshake you can see from across the yard. She fell down the stairs and she died of it, and Della, who'd come to help with the new baby, who'd been sleeping in the next room, Della had heard it. Not a fall. She'd heard what came before the fall. She didn't say the words for it in the yard, and I won't say them here. The men's faces said enough, and a thing you've heard through a wall in the dark doesn't need describing to land. "And I knew," Della said, "that whatever he'd done to my sister over 4 years, he had the rest of his life to do to her daughter. The law gave her to him. The law that wrote fell down the stairs on Ruth, so I took her. I took her in the night and I walked. Because there wasn't a thing left in this world I could do for Ruth, and there was one thing I could do for Ruth's girl, and I did it. And you can hang me for it if you want, but you'll hang me with her crying in my arms because I am not putting her down." The yard didn't make a sound. And then Halloran, old Halloran, who'd buried his own children, who never smelled cinnamon at our table and never knew why, Halloran stepped his horse forward without a word and stopped it between Della and Voss. And then Coleman did. And then Prout, washed-neck Prout, with his jaw set like he'd been waiting his whole young life to be in exactly this place. And then all of them, the whole crew, one by one, putting their bodies into the cold between a frightened woman and a man with the law on his side, not saying anything, because there wasn't anything to say. There was only where you chose to stand. I'll tell you what broke it. It wasn't the guns, though there were guns and Voss could count. It was Hutchins. The sheriff sat his horse a long moment, looking at that wall of men, looking at Voss, looking at the baby. And he was not a brave man or a good one particularly. But there's a thing that can happen even to a tired lawman who likes the law because it saves him from judging. Sometimes the judging happens to him anyway, against his will, and he can't get out from under it. "Voss," Hutchins said slowly, "your paper says you can take the child. It surely does." He folded it back up. "But it don't say I got to help you, and it don't say these men got to step aside. And I find I'm not of a mind to spend powder making them, over a baby, in January, on the word of a man whose sister-in-law I believe a sight more than I believe him." He put the paper in his coat. You want this child, you'll go to the county and you'll bring more law than me, and you'll explain to a judge how your wife came to fall down those stairs, with this woman ready to swear to what she heard. You game for that, Garrett? You want this in front of a judge with her telling it. Voss was not game for that. You could watch him not be game for it. The whole tall, handsome architecture of him recalculated in about 3 seconds, the way a coward recalculates, and arrived at the only sum a coward ever arrives at. Not worth it. Not worth the risk. Not worth a real fight. He'd wanted an easy collection. A frightened woman handing over a child in a cold yard. And instead he had 11 armed men and a sheriff gone sideways on him, and the actual prospect of his actual life held up to actual light. He put his hat back on. He said something about how this wasn't finished, how he had rights, how we'd be hearing from lawyers. The things men like that say when the room has turned, and they need to leave it without admitting the room has turned. And then he rode out, him and his fine horse, back down the road he'd come up, and we stood in the yard and watched him go small against the snow. Della did not move until he was gone past the far gate. Then her legs went, just folded. Prout caught them both, her and the baby, and got her inside, and she came apart at the kitchen table the way she hadn't let herself come apart since the night I carried her up the road. Not from sorrow. From the thing that comes after you've held the door against the dark for 3 months and somebody finally, bolts it from the other side. He didn't come back with lawyers. I'll spoil that much of part 3 for you because I don't want you carrying that particular dread through the spring. A man like Voss does his arithmetic, and a public fight with a witness was never going to pencil out for him. He found, I heard later, a younger wife 2 counties over inside the year. The thought of her keeps me up some nights, even now. But he never came back up our road, and he never sent the law, and slowly, Della stopped going to the window. But I've skipped the heaviest part, and I won't let myself skip it, because if I do I've lied to you the way I lied to her that first night in the kitchen. The heaviest part isn't the standoff. The heaviest part came a week before it, and it was a thing Della did alone, that nobody asked her to do, that cost her more than facing Voss ever could. She'd written to the county herself, before Voss came. In December, soon as the road allowed, she'd had me help her get a letter to the county seat, and the letter didn't beg for protection. The letter told the whole thing. Ruth, the stairs, all of it. She'd signed her real name to it. Her real name, which I learned for the first time watching her write it, and which I'll keep, because she kept it from us so long for reasons that were hers. She put her real name on a sworn account of what she'd heard through a wall, knowing that the same letter that might save Pearl could just as easily see Della herself charged with taking the child, could see her own self in front of the very judge she was summoning. She'd done the arithmetic Voss had taught her sister, and she'd done it backwards. Stay safe and keep her by hiding, and live in fear of every horse on the road forever. Or step into the light and tell it true and risk losing her to the law for good, but maybe, end it. She chose the light. She chose the risk that could lose her everything, because hiding wasn't living and she wanted Pearl to live, not hide. That's the morally heavy thing. Not stealing the baby, that was instinct. Anybody with a heart steals that baby. The heavy thing was choosing in cold blood, weeks later, to stop running and stand in the open where the law could see her, gambling the child she'd bled for against the chance of a real freedom for her. That's the decision I think about. That's the one that tells you what she was made of. When Voss rode up with Hutchins that January morning, it wasn't bad luck that the sheriff already half disbelieved him. Della had written the county. Word had reached Hutchins. She'd seeded the ground a month before, alone, terrified, and then walked out coatless into the yard to harvest it. The men think they saved her that day. I've never corrected them. But she'd saved herself, weeks earlier, with a letter and a real name and a courage that doesn't fit in any ledger I keep. That's the winter. Now let me tell you about the spring and how a ranch comes to have a heart, and what it costs, and what it's worth. The first thaw came in late March, the way it always does here, not as a gift but as a mess. The yard turned to a foot of mud you lost boots in. The creek came up brown and loud. Calving season hit all at once, the way it does, and for 3 weeks none of us slept, and Della, who by then had been with us 4 months, pulled a calf out of a heifer in the rain at 2 in the morning with her sleeves shoved up and Pearl asleep in a saddlebag basket under the lean-to. And she did it because Coleman's hands were too big for the angle and hers weren't. And afterward she leaned against the fence and laughed until she cried, mud to the elbows. And that's the moment, if I'm honest, that I stopped thinking of her as a stranger we were sheltering and started thinking of her as ours. I don't know how to make you feel the way a season turns on a ranch. The light comes back first before the warmth, long and gold in the evenings, and the men start lingering outside after supper because they can, because they're not racing the dark anymore. The cottonwoods along the creek fuzz out green. The meadowlarks come back. There's a sound, the meadowlark, that means the worst is over, and the first morning you hear it after a winter like that one, something in your chest you didn't know was clenched, let's go. And there was Della in all of it. By spring she'd long since stopped being the cook who couldn't cook. She ran the kitchen, and then somehow she ran more than the kitchen, not because anyone gave it to her, but because she was the one who noticed things. She noticed Prout was sweet on a girl in town and was making a fool of himself by letters, and she sat him down and fixed his letters, and he's married to that girl now with 3 children of his own. She noticed Reese, stony, solitary Reese, who'd lived alone in that big house with 2 rooms shut up. She noticed he'd started taking his supper at the kitchen table instead of alone in his study, and she never said a word about it, just always set him a place, like it was nothing, like it had always been so. I noticed her noticing all of it. That was my spring. I watched a woman who'd arrived owning nothing become the thing the whole place organized itself around, the way iron filings organize around a magnet you can't see. The hands brought her their troubles. The neighbors, when they came, asked after her by name. Pearl learned to crawl across the kitchen floor, and the whole ranch treated it as a civic event. The shut-up rooms in Reese's house got opened and aired, and one of them became Pearl's with a window facing the creek, and nobody ever quite said out loud that Della and Pearl had stopped being guests, because some things you ruin by saying them. That's the sweet part, and it's true, and I could end there and the title would be satisfied. By spring, she had become the heart of the ranch. She had, every word of it. But I told you at the start that some sums don't come out even, and I won't cheat you on the last page. Because here is the thing about Della that spring couldn't fix, and that I don't think anything ever fixed, and that I'd be lying to leave out. She still went to the window. Less, much less, but I'd catch her some evenings in the gold light with the meadowlarks going and Pearl safe and the whole warm ranch humming around her. I'd catch her at the window, looking down the road. Just for a second. The old checking rhythm, gone almost but not all the way gone. And I came to understand that you don't walk into a blizzard owning nothing and come out the other side unmarked. The fear had a home in her that the spring couldn't evict. Voss never came back, but he'd left something in her anyway, a permanent half-turn toward the door, a part of her that would, until she died, keep one eye on the road. And there was the other thing, the heavier thing, the thing I'd watch cross her face sometimes when she thought no one was looking, usually when Pearl did something new, first word, first steps, the ordinary miracles. Joy, and right behind the joy, like its shadow, the grief. Because every one of those firsts belonged by rights to Ruth. Della was raising her sister's daughter and loving her with a whole heart, and every single day that love was also a small fresh proof that Ruth was gone and would never see any of it. You could watch her hold both at once. The joy and the grief, riding the same face. I never found words for it and I've stopped trying. Some things you just witness. She told me once, late, near the end of that first spring, when I'd come to think we could speak plain to each other. She said the worst of it wasn't fear of Voss anymore. The worst of it was that some mornings Pearl would do a thing, a tilt of the head, a particular laugh that was Ruth's exactly. Ruth come up through the child like water through stone, and it would gut her, and she'd have to leave the room. I'm raising my sister's ghost and my sister's daughter in the same little body, she said. And I love her so much I can't breathe, and I'll never once be able to tell her the whole truth of where she came from, not for years, not till she's grown, and maybe not even then. She looked at me. How do you keep a secret that big from somebody you love that much, Walt? You keep books. You tell me the arithmetic on that one. I didn't have it. I still don't. I've kept the books on this ranch for going on 20 years now, and that's the one column I've never been able to make balance. Here's where I'll leave it, because I've thought a long time about how to end this, and I keep coming back to a single evening. It was full spring by then. Supper was done. The men were out in the long gold light. Somebody had a fiddle going badly, and there was that loose, easy laughter that means a hard season's behind you. Reese was on the porch in his shirt sleeves, Edmund Reese, a thing I'd not seen in a decade. And Della was in the doorway of the kitchen with Pearl on her hip, watching all of it, watching the ranch she'd somehow grown into the center of without ever once asking to. And Pearl reached out toward the light, toward the men, toward the fiddle, toward the whole warm, noisy living world that this woman had carried her into through a blizzard owning nothing. Pearl reached out with both fat hands and said a word. Not Mama. She never called Della Mama, and Della never asked her to. That was another of those things ruined by saying. The word Pearl said was home, or near enough to it. The garbled first word version. Home. Home. And I watched Della's face do the thing it did. The joy. And right behind it, fast as ever, the shadow. Ruth, who should have heard that word, who'd never hear any word. Both at once. The whole impossible arithmetic of it, crossing one woman's face in the space of a breath. She didn't wipe her eyes. She'd long since stopped hiding that from us. She just held the baby tighter and looked out at the light, and the meadowlarks were going down by the creek, and somewhere in her, I knew, one small permanent part was still turned toward the road, would always be turned toward the road. I closed the ledger. Some nights you don't finish the books. Some nights the sums can wait. She'd come up that road with nothing. By spring she was the heart of the place. Both those things are true, and the second one doesn't cancel the first. She didn't arrive with nothing and then get filled up. She arrived with nothing and gave us everything she didn't have. And we never did learn how a person does that, where it comes from, what it costs at the bottom where the books don't reach.